Hello, good evening and welcome. This is a quick PowerPoint trying to help you get the fundamentals of the problem of evil and suffering, preparing for what will probably be your mock examination. I hope it's of use to you. Feel free to leave comments if they're constructive and feedback. One of the first things we might be tempted to start revising is the solution provided by St. Augustine. However, this is not the most logical place to start. Instead, we'll be better at looking at the problem of evil in isolation for a moment. Augustine did pose the problem himself, however. He said, either God cannot abolish evil or he will not. If he cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he will not, then he is not all good. And we know that another scholar we might wish to use when talking about the problem of evil in those logical terms is J.L. Mackie and the inconsistent triad. That's when talking about the a priori logical problem. That's as opposed to the a posteriori or evidential problem. And to understand the difference between these two, you only need to think really about the difference between priori logic and posteriori reasoning, which is that if you believe that the best argument against God's existence is the existence of any evil at all, then you're proposing a logical problem, meaning that you believe that the characteristics, the divine attributes of omniscience, benevolence, and omnipotence mean that there really shouldn't be any evil and suffering in the world at all. Then you're proposing the a priori problem. If, however, you point to a specific example, such as the Holocaust, then you might be suggesting that actually it's the sheer weight of evidence in the world that suggests that there is no God, or that God does not have the divine attributes. If you have to point to specific examples, or if specific examples are what is actually aiding your argument, then it is the a posteriori evidential argument. Otherwise, it might be the traditional logical formulation of the problem, and knowing the difference is going to help you. One final thing to bear in mind at this stage as well is that you may not be asked specifically about the problem of evil. Instead, you might be asked about suffering, and if that is the case, then you should always discuss the link between evil and suffering, which is that evil actually leads directly to the sufferings of the world. Evil causes suffering. Okay, let's have another look at this guy then. Augustine, we can see Augustine, born 354, died 430, and that he's the patron saint of brewers, but let's get a bit more into his views. Okay, his theory is often considered to align with something called the free will defense, which shows that his argument is going to essentially suggest that the reason why evil and suffering exist in the world is because of the existence of true free will, or what we may come to call as true moral autonomy. That says autonomy, sorry, the writing sometimes gets a bit difficult to read. The first key feature of the Augustinian theodicy is that his argument is based on key biblical passages, both the arguments in Genesis and St. Paul's writing in Romans. Now, Augustine's opening premise is that God, who is perfect and therefore all-powerful, all-loving, made a good world. Now, by good, he takes the Genesis as inspiration for that. God saw all that he made and it was good. I believe it says it 6 times in the start of Genesis. And for Augustine, that means perfect, especially when we bear in mind that he believes that God created the world ex from nihilo, from nothing. Think about the implications for that. That means that there was nothing prior to God's creation, and therefore God must be responsible for all of creation. That leads many to believe that God therefore must have created evil, but Augustine does not hold to that because he takes Scripture to be accurate when it says God created everything good. God's creation was therefore absolutely perfect. Evil must have come from within the world. Now, the way to think about Augustine's theodicy is like this. After the creation of a good universe, angels and man fell. Now, this is because Adam and Eve freely chose to disobey God, which is why we might align Augustine with those of the free will defence. They chose not to do what is good and rejected what God had told them to do, and in doing so chose non-being material things rather than the fullness of their being. Hence they brought disharmony in nature through the introduction of original sin. Now, it does mean first sin, and it also means sin that all humans, as they are similarly present in Adam, as it says over here, now inherit. This for Augustine means that humans fell from a very close relationship with God because they actually chose evil. But even the phrasing of that, choose to do evil, makes it sound like they've seized this substance that is evil. But if we look over in this direction, we can see that actually evil is of course not a substance, it's a privation of good. So rather than choosing the evil thing, they chose not to do the good thing, which was to stay in a fullness of relationship with God. And that's the mistake that Adam and Eve make in the fall in Genesis 3. In Latin, the phrase is privatio boni, a lack of the good. And Augustine uses an analogy to explain this, which might be the analogy of blindness. If we think about blindness, it only exists off the back of a perfect creation gone wrong. That is the creation of sight, that is the creation of eyes, the ability to see. Or think of it like shining light into a dark cave. Darkness itself only exists because of a lack of the light. Now, for Augustine, human beings, and this is a key word, one that I'd like to see mentioned more, human beings are therefore responsible and deserve the punishment that they receive from God. We deserve to be punished because we are responsible. Sorry, that's an arrow there. So, according to Augustine's view as well, if a human is being evil or their actions are evil, you are saying that they behave in a way that does not match God's expectations. For example, if you racially abuse people, rob or torture them, you're not living up to the standards expected of human beings. It is the failure to be what you should be that is wrong. And I'm quoting here Brian Poxon and Laura Mears' AS Philosophy Revision Guide for EdXL Unit 1, and I think that it's a really useful resource. According to Augustine then, both moral and natural evil actually stem from the choices that were made by Adam and Eve. Pain in childbirth and hard work making the soil productive are both immediate results that are listed in Genesis 3. So there you go, you've got Genesis scriptural support for the idea that certain natural unavoidable evils are due to that balance of nature being broken, the disharmony in nature, and this also does rest on the fallen angel of Lucifer as well. Augustine concedes that free will is a good thing because of God actually desired people to have the freedom to make right choices, which does mean that God foresaw the fall, which is a point that people often pick up in AO2 to say if God foresaw the fall, you might argue that perhaps God is responsible. This point down here is the point that people often miss from their essay. It's that God is just in not intervening. This is the point that I say protects God's character. You wouldn't write Augustine protects God's character by. Instead, I'd prefer it if you phrased it something like the theodicy serves to show that God's character is still just, as God is justified in allowing people to be punished because they deserve it, but also that God is graceful, and the reason why God is graceful is because he sent Jesus Christ to redeem the relationship, or because he sent Jesus Christ for atonement, and this allows people to gain access to heaven and be one with God and fix the relationship. And it's not really something human beings deserve because of always so frequently not choosing the right thing to do. Here we have a list of some of the ideas that I may have explained on the previous slide, such as the analogy of the blindness and evil coming about as a result of a misuse of free will. A good word here, which is that humans are now estranged from God. And immorality has begun to thrive, and Here we have about the atonement, and these are explanatory AO1 style paragraphs, and we get the key idea of Augustine's theodicy being referred to as a soul-deciding theodicy, and that is because at the end of our lives we're going one way or the other, and it's concerned with judgment, and the world serves the purpose of being a judgment-driven world, where at the end of our lives it's decided whether we go to heaven or hell. With every key feature there are strengths, and with every strength there's a weakness if you think about it differently. So I'm going to give you an example now. If we think about evil as a privation, why is that a strength? Personally, when I think about that point of view, the idea that evil is a privation, and I think about the analogy and light and dark, I think that that sounds highly logical. And we can actually see the argument makes some rational sense to say that the absence of, for example, heat makes us cold, but heat is itself the substance. I think that's completely coherent. However, Stephen Law challenges this idea. That's Stephen Law, saying that from the clues in the universe, we could actually make the same case, except for rather than a benevolent God, that's my son, he's won a race up the stairs, a benevolent God, we get a malevolent God. He says there is just as much evidence in the world for an evil God as a loving God. And so we could argue that the evil is the actual substance and the goodness is the privation.
Daddy?
Pardon?
What are you wearing those?
I'm wearing these because I'm teaching my students. Do you want to say hello?
No.
And here we can see that the strength of the analogy, and you should be able to try and think of strengths and weaknesses, well, you need to think of strengths and weaknesses with all the key features. The strength is that it's logical, but the weakness might be that the argument could be made in reverse for a different type of God. Now we'll have a look at this summary and see if we can identify some other strengths and weaknesses from a particular key feature of the Augustinian theodicy. If we look at the role that freedom plays in the Augustinian theodicy, we should be able to find some weaknesses then. Some argue, for example, the fact that freedom leads to the fall and that freedom leads to suffering is a problem for Augustine, because Augustine believes the creation was perfectly good. Now, why would a perfect creation go wrong? As was pointed out by Schleiermacher. Why would it go wrong? Schleiermacher suggests that this is a logical contradiction. And I think that's a point that I'd like to see you use in your AO2. Schleiermacher says it's a logical contradiction that a perfect creation could go wrong. And how could such a world go wrong if there was no knowledge of evil for humanity to choose at the fall? Furthermore, if we wonder why humans and angels would actually choose the wrong thing to do, and if we see that God foresaw the fall, surely God should bear some responsibility. The question of why would angels that are with God and his creations that are perfect and with God, why would they choose to do something to not obey God? This weakness even seemed to stump Augustine. Augustine wondered about why one would turn away from God, and he said himself, "Let no one then seek to know from me what I know that I do not know." He is suggesting there that he really couldn't provide an answer to that question. If we look at this slide, we can see another summary of the main features of Augustine. And we've even got a couple that I would like you to consider adding that are not on here, which are the idea of God being graceful by sending Jesus, the second Adam, and God being just by allowing punishment because we all share original sin and because we're all seminally present in Adam's loins. But again, some would argue that that is a weakness, because despite the offer of God's grace because of Christ redeeming for our sins, is it fair that there's a system in which successive generations inherit original sin? Does that really give you the impression of a just God? Furthermore, scientific understanding questions the idea that we are all actually seminally present in Adam, which if we don't take a literal reading of Genesis, then okay, you might be able to avoid. But the idea of us all being similarly present in Adam doesn't seem to imply a literal interpretation of Genesis, which the theory of evolution and natural selection can be seen to challenge. Now we move on to the Irenaean theodicy, and here we have some information about Irenaeus. You know that his major work was against heresies, and that his work was brought back into popular consideration by John Hick in Evil and the God of Love, 1966, good year for football. Don't make the mistake of thinking Irenaeus lived at the same time as Augustine, who was actually before, of course we know. Okay, this explains quite clearly that Augustine's theodicy contrasts with the idea of soul deciding, with the idea of soul making or developing. You see it written in different ways. Irenaeus says that evil was a necessary byproduct of humanity's spiritual journey. Well, what is that journey? Actually, Irenaeus took the Genesis story quite literally, and he says that we were created in an immature state, and that we were moving from, as it says in Genesis 1:26, from God's image, and we are required to go through soul making, which requires suffering, to get into God's likeness. I believe it's Peter Cole that describes this idea as moving from, and you can mention both of these in your essays, from human animals to, this is children of God. This may mean that in the early form then, humans were actually in an immature state. Now, when we're in an immature state, we are more childlike, and like the way that we might consider raising children, we have to be truly free or have true moral autonomy to make real mistakes in order to learn and to develop. We might therefore say for Irenaeus that there's an education involved for humans that is provided by suffering. So we might begin to wonder then, what sort of development do we get as a result of evil and suffering? Well, we might get tests. And if we think about the story of Jonah or Job in the Bible, then we see how they experienced suffering and responded to the tests, and they serve as examples. We might also get opportunities to help others, opportunities to be charitable, brave, or we may develop, and this is perhaps the most important, but we get the opportunity to develop moral virtue as other people suffer and we reach out to them, or as we suffer and we learn to be resilient. Irenaeus would therefore describe evil and suffering as necessary parts of this environment for humans. If we look through this slide, we see humans were created in the image of God in an immature moral state, that we can, through struggle and real life experience, according to Irenaeus and of course Hick, we can learn to develop true moral virtue and develop into the likeness of God. And this is called soul making, and the followers of the Irenaean theodicy think that it may continue even after death. It may need to. And Hick has a term for this world, which is a veil of soul making. I haven't read it in enough essays lately, but he would describe this world as a perfect place for that type of development. Here we see a justification for suffering and evil according to the Irenaean theodicy. First of all, some forms of suffering and evil are just practical. If we think about hunger leading to pain and giving us the knowledge that we need to go and feed ourselves, look after ourselves. Also, we get the opportunity for character building, and I think I've already explained a little bit about that, but I'm going to deal with that one again in a moment. The third is that some suffering and evil is part of a natural, a predictable environment. Now, these are debatable, contentious issues. And what Irenaeus meant by the predictable environment is that the environment follows scientific or physical law. I showed you a clip in class. If a huge rock falls off a building or off a cliff and flies towards you and hits you in the face and kills you, then it's not because the rock had a particular issue with you, your personality, your character, or what you did last week. It's because it's following predictable scientific laws. But this one is debatable because we might wonder whether everything in science is going to be totally predictable. On a quantum physical level, some movement seems to be random. Perhaps there'll be some things that we never know. Does it really seem fair that some people can develop tumours that kill them at an early age or something like that? Does it always seem predictable? It's one of the potential AO2 points that you can pick up. But for Irenaeus, he's suggesting here that a lot of evil and suffering, like, for example, if the suffering comes from the loss of a village, but you built your village at the bottom of a volcano and it erupts, then perhaps there's no moral issue there, in that the world is not morally you're not experiencing suffering necessarily because of a moral issue, but more because the world has to follow scientific laws. Another good point you might want to make for AO2 is about this idea of that it is character building. Swinburne says, we would never learn the art of goodness in a world designed as a complete paradise. And I have given you examples of that. How can we be charitable if everybody has everything they desired? I don't think that's logical. But equally, this point comes under real criticism from Richard Dawkins. You'll remember that he seems to have a real dislike for Swinburne, but he did say that he was on a show with him, and there's quotes in Swinburne's book, Is There a God?, where he states that if one less person were to have burnt, and those are his words, in Hiroshima, then it would be one less opportunity for moral development, which for some people might seem a little bit harsh. Or you might say that a God that needs to teach us in that way is not, either doesn't exist or is not worthy of worship, which is certainly what Richard Dawkins would say. Or you can hear the type of thing Dawkins might say for yourself. Dawkins would argue that type of reasoning is in fact evil.
They're doing good things, and that's why religion is evil, because it can make you do evil things, believing that they are good.
So he would argue that that is an evil belief, in fact. Now, heaven and hell do play an important role, but some followers of the Irenaean theodicy reject the notion of hell's existence or its being eternal. So some think it can't be eternal because of this idea of continuing soul development. If suffering develops us, then if you experience suffering, you're going to continue to develop. So after a long time in this place, you deserve to be in this place. So some followers of the theodicy reject the notion of hell in a view that some call universalism, the idea that all will get to heaven, and some others might want to criticise universalism, saying, do some people really deserve it? What about the most evil people in the world, like Adolf Hitler or Tony Blair? Here we have a summary of the Irenaean theodicy, and again, most of these ideas should have inherent strengths and weaknesses. You can find many in your textbook or in your notes. I'm going to talk about one here, which is one that I'd like to explain in a bit more depth, which is the epistemic distance, which is introduced by John Hick. And he says that in order to act freely, humans are kept at an epistemic distance by God, which translates to a knowledge gap, and this stops us being overwhelmed. If you think about it, you don't behave as well when there's a policeman in the room. Well, maybe you behave better, actually, sorry, that's the way I should have put it, but you get the point. When an authority is in the room, we behave quite differently. God, therefore, needs to be at a distance in order for humans to act freely, or as in Hick's words, to not be overwhelmed. It's not just about behaving well if God are in the room, it's more about being completely overwhelmed and having no true moral autonomy to choose whether or not we follow God's instruction or develop morally. Now, this is a strength of the theodicy, as it shows God's relationship with the world, but it also might be a weakness of the theodicy, because we could ask, why would Adam and Eve sin? Because they were not at an epistemic distance from God. So as always, where we've got the clear strength of a theory, we've got an associated weakness, and you must know these specifically for the AO2 part of your essay. Here we have a general summary of the Irenaean theodicy, and a good exercise for you to do would be to make sure that you can talk about strengths and weaknesses of every key feature. It's also important to note that there are some comparable features, and when we break a theodicy into its smaller parts, we now know that we are analysing. And when we look through and we compare comparable features and we favour one or the other, for example, I favour the idea that man must have been created imperfectly because it fits in better with the idea of evolution, which I would definitely write in my essay. When we do this, we're starting to evaluate. When we compare and contrast these two ideas and we value one idea higher than the other, we're starting to evaluate. Hope that's been useful to you. Don't forget to make a table of strengths and weaknesses. Good luck with your revision. And there's also process theology. Again, this can't be everything, but hopefully it's helped you with the fundamentals.